The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millbrook when 7-year-old Emma Whitfield stumbled into town, her small frame trembling and her eyes wide with terror. Blood stained her torn dress, and strange marks covered her. Pale arms like ancient symbols carved into flesh. Behind her, smoke billowed from what remained of the Henderson farmhouse, where 3 bodies lay cold among the ashes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That child is evil. Mrs. Patterson shrieked from her porch, pointing a gnarled finger at the girl. Look what she's done. The devil's marked her. The crowd gathered quickly, their voices rising in fear and accusation. But through the chaos, a figure emerged from the tree-line, tall, silent, with weathered skin and eyes that held the wisdom of generations. Joseph Crow Feather had been watching. He had seen what others refused to see. And as the mob closed in on the terrified child, he stepped forward, knowing that this moment would change everything. What happened next would reveal a truth so profound that it would shake the very foundations of what the people of Millbrook thought they knew about good and evil. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under the pale October sky of 1887, its golden grasslands swaying like ocean waves in the crisp autumn wind. Millbrook sat like a small island of civilization in this vast wilderness, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt roads that housed barely 300 souls. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where currency and strangers were viewed with suspicion. Joseph Crow Feather had never been welcomed in Millbrook, despite living on its outskirts for over 2 decades. The white settlers tolerated his presence because he caused no trouble and occasionally helped with difficult horses or tracked lost livestock through terrain that baffled the townspeople. But tolerance was not acceptance, and Joseph had learned long ago to keep his distance from the wooden buildings and their inhabitants. He lived alone in a modest cabin built against a hillside overlooking Willow Creek, surrounded by the kind of silence that most people found unsettling but that Joseph considered essential for listening to the world's deeper rhythms. His Lakota grandmother had taught him that everything spoke if you knew how to listen: the wind through the grass, the movement of animals, the very stones beneath your feet. On this particular morning, Joseph had risen before dawn, as was his custom, and made his way to the creek for water. The horses in his small corral nickered softly as he passed, recognizing his steady footsteps. He had 3 mares and a stallion, all of them descended from the great horses his people had once ridden across these same plains. They were his connection to a way of life that the advancing tide of settlements had all but erased. As he knelt by the creek, filling his leather water pouch, Joseph felt the familiar weight of solitude settle around him like a well-worn blanket. He was 43 years old, had never married, and spoke perhaps a dozen words on a busy day. The townspeople called him the Silent Indian when they spoke of him at all, though few bothered to learn his actual name. Joseph didn't mind. Words had always seemed unnecessary to him, especially when actions spoke so much more clearly. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when Joseph first noticed the smoke dot. It rose from the direction of the Henderson place, a thin black column against the blue sky that immediately set off alarms in his mind. Smoke could mean many things: a cooking fire gone wrong, burning, a chimney problem. But something about this smoke felt different. It was too black, too thick, and it carried on the wind a scent that made his horses restless, and his own instincts sharpened to knife-edge alertness. Joseph set down his water pouch and moved to higher ground, climbing the rocky outcrop behind his cabin that gave him a clear view across the valley. From this vantage point, he could see the Henderson farm spread out below, the main house, the barn, the chicken coop, and the small vegetable garden that Martha Henderson tended with such care. What he saw made his blood run cold. The house was engulfed in flames, great orange tongues licking at the wooden walls, and sending sparks spiraling into the sky. But it wasn't the fire itself that alarmed Joseph most. It was the unnatural stillness surrounding it. No one was running with buckets of water. No one was trying to save livestock from the barn. The entire homestead appeared completely abandoned, as if everyone had simply vanished. Joseph's sharp eyes caught movement near the tree line, a small figure stumbling away from the burning building. Even from this distance, he could tell it was a child moving in the jerky, unsteady way that spoke of shock or injury. Without hesitation, Joseph began climbing down from the rocks, his moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that would have challenged a mountain goat. He moved through the grassland like a shadow, using every fold in the terrain to stay hidden. As he made his way toward the Henderson property, years of hunting and tracking had taught him to read the land like a book, and right now that book was telling him a story that made no sense. There were no wagon tracks leading away from the farm, no signs of raiders or thieves. Whatever had happened here had come from within. As Joseph drew closer to the burning house, the smell hit him with full force, not just wood smoke, but something else. Something that spoke of violence and death. He had smelled it before, during the wars of his youth, and it never failed to trigger memories he preferred to keep buried. But this was different somehow. Underneath the familiar sense of destruction was something else, something that reminded him of the old stories his grandmother used to tell about spirits and transformations. The child was perhaps 50 yards ahead of him now, still moving toward town but weaving like a drunk. Joseph could see that it was a girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, wearing what had once been a white dress but was now stained with soot. And something darker. Her blonde hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and even from behind, Joseph could see that she was in some kind of distress. He was about to call out to her when she suddenly collapsed, falling forward into the tall grass and lying still. Joseph increased his pace, no longer bothering to stay hidden. If the child was injured, she needed help immediately, and there was no one else around to provide it. When he reached her, Joseph felt his breath catch in his throat. The girl was unconscious but breathing, her small chest rising and falling rapidly, but it was her appearance that stopped him cold. Her arms and legs were covered in what looked like burn marks, but they weren't random. They formed patterns, intricate, deliberate designs that seemed to spiral and flow across her pale skin like living tattoos. Joseph had seen similar markings before, in the sacred caves where his grandmother had taken him as a boy. They were symbols of power, of transformation, of things that existed between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. But seeing them on the skin of a white child in the middle of the Dakota Territory was impossible. It was like finding ocean shells in the mountains or snow in midsummer. The girl's eyes fluttered open as Joseph knelt beside her, and when she looked at him, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale, blue and seemingly infinite, but there was something moving in their depths that was older than her 7 years. Much older. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They're coming for me." Joseph looked back toward the burning Henderson house, then down at the strange child who had somehow survived whatever terrible thing had happened. There, every instinct told him to be careful, to maintain his distance from whatever forces had been unleashed at the Henderson farm. But when he looked into those impossibly deep eyes, he saw something that overrode all caution, pure, desperate fear. Without a word, Joseph scooped the girl up in his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, as if some essential part of her was missing, and her skin felt strange against his hands, too warm in some places, too cold in others. But she was a child in need, and that was all that mattered. As he began walking toward town, the girl curled against his chest and whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. But somehow, impossibly, he understood their meaning. She was saying "thank you" over and over, in a tongue that sounded like wind through autumn leaves. The first person to see them was old Henrik Larsson, who was checking his fence line when Joseph emerged from the tall grass, carrying what appeared to be a blood-covered child. Henrik's reaction was immediate and violent. He stumbled backward, crossed himself, and began shouting for help in a voice that cracked with terror. "Lord, preserve us. It's the Henderson girl. She's covered in blood." Word spread through Millbrook with the speed that only true panic can achieve. People poured out of houses and businesses, gathering in the street to stare at the strange procession of the silent Lakota man carrying the small, marked child. Joseph could feel their fear like a living thing, pressing against him from all sides. "Put her down," Martha Colby screamed from her porch. "Don't you dare bring that thing into our town." "Look at those marks," added Samuel Pierce, the blacksmith. "That's devil's work if I ever seen it." Joseph kept walking, his face expressionless. The girl clutched protectively against his chest. He had dealt with fear before, had seen how it could transform ordinary people into dangerous mobs. But he had never seen anything quite like this, the raw, primal terror that seemed to radiate from every person who looked at the child. Dr. William Crawford pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand and his face set with professional determination. Joseph had always respected the doctor, one of the few townspeople who had ever treated him with basic human dignity. "Bring her to my office," Dr. Crawford said quietly. "Whatever's happened, she needs medical attention." But before Joseph could take another step, Mrs. Patterson appeared at the front of the crowd, her face twisted with religious fury and her finger pointing accusingly at the girl. "That child is evil," she shrieked, her voice carrying clearly over the growing murmur of the crowd. "Look what she's done. The devil's marked her. She burned down the Henderson place and killed them all." The crowd erupted into chaos, voices rising in fear and anger, hands reaching for whatever weapons they could find. Joseph saw the shift happening, the way individual people were becoming something else entirely, a mob with a single terrible purpose. He looked down at the girl in his arms, whose pale eyes had gone wide with terror, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of continuing toward the doctor's office, Joseph turned and began walking back, the way he had come, moving with the steady, implacable pace of someone who had made up his mind and would not be deterred. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Stop him," someone shouted. "Don't let him take her." But Joseph didn't stop. He walked through the crowd like they weren't there, his face carved from stone, the frightened child pressed against his chest. And as he walked, something extraordinary happened. The girl began to glow. It started as barely visible shimmer around her skin, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But as the crowd's fury grew louder and more violent, the glow intensified, becoming a soft, pearl-like radiance that seemed to push back against the darkness of their fear. Joseph felt it too, a warmth spreading through his chest where the girl rested, a sense of something vast and ancient awakening. The markings on her skin began to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. And suddenly he understood that what the townspeople saw as evil was actually something far more complex and infinitely more precious. This was no ordinary child. This was something that had been hidden, protected, kept safe in the illusion of normalcy until whatever had happened at the Henderson farm had shattered that protection forever. And now she was his responsibility, whether he had chosen it or not. As they reached the edge of town, Joseph heard hoofbeats behind them, men mounting horses, organizing pursuit. He looked down at the girl, whose glow was now bright enough to cast shadows, and spoke the first words he had said aloud in over a month. "Hold tight," he whispered. "We're going home." The girl nodded, her strange eyes reflecting depths of understanding that no 7-year-old should possess. And as Joseph began to run, carrying her across the grassland toward his cabin by Willow Creek, he knew that everything in his carefully ordered, Solitary life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Joseph's cabin sat nestled against the hillside like it had grown there naturally, built from logs he had cut and shaped with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. It was modest but sturdy, with a stone chimney that drew perfectly and windows positioned to catch the morning light. Most importantly, it was hidden tucked into a fold of land that made it invisible from the main road and approachable only by paths that Joseph himself had carved through the terrain. He carried Emma through the door and set her gently on the mighty wooden bench beside his small table. The girl had stopped glowing during their flight across the grassland, but the strange markings on her skin remained vivid, seeming to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. She sat quietly, her pale eyes taking in every detail of his simple home with an intensity that made Joseph wonder what she was really seeing. The cabin's interior reflected its owner's practical nature. Hand-carved furniture occupied precisely the space it needed and no more. Cooking utensils hung from wooden pegs driven into the log walls. A bed frame held a mattress stuffed with prairie grass and covered with blankets woven by Joseph's grandmother decades ago. Everything had its place, and everything served a purpose, but it was the far wall that would have surprised any visitor. Joseph had covered it with what appeared to be a map of the surrounding territory, but not the kind that surveyors or railroad men would recognize. This map showed the land as his people had always seen it, not as property to be divided and sold, but as a living thing with sacred places marked in symbols that predated European settlement by centuries. Emma approached this wall with the careful steps of someone entering a holy place. Her small fingers traced the painted symbols, and as she did, they began to glow with the same pearl-like radiance that had emanated from her skin in town. "You know what these mean," Joseph said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded without turning around. "Grandmother showed me. Before before everything changed." Joseph felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Your grandmother was Martha Henderson?" "No." Emma's voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Martha was kind, but she wasn't my real grandmother. My real grandmother lived in the place between places where the old spirits still walk. She taught me the true names of things." The girl turned to face him, and Joseph saw tears streaming down her cheeks. But the tears themselves were strange. They caught the light like liquid crystal and seemed to leave no tracks on her skin. "They found us 3 days ago," Emma continued. "The men in black coats who smell like burnt iron. They said I was an abomination, that I corrupted everything I touched. Grandmother tried to hide me, but they had machines that could see through her. Protections." Joseph had heard whispers of such men government agents who hunted what they called anomalies in the territories. Most people dismissed the stories as frontier nonsense, but Joseph's grandmother had warned him about those who would destroy anything they couldn't understand or control. "What happened at the Henderson farm?" he asked gently. Emma's face crumpled, and when she spoke, her words came out in a rush of grief and terror. "Grandmother told me to run to the Hendersons if anything ever happened to her. She said Martha had a kind heart and would protect me until I could find my way home. But when I got there, the men in black coats were already waiting." The girl wrapped her arms around herself, and the temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees. Frost began forming on the windows despite the warm October afternoon. "They questioned the Hendersons about me. Thomas tried to lie, said he'd never seen me before, but the machines they carried could taste deception in the air. When Martha tried to stand between me and them, they—" Emma's voice broke entirely. Joseph knelt beside her, not touching but offering his presence as comfort. He had learned long ago that some grief was too large for words or gestures. "The fire wasn't my fault," Emma whispered. "When they hurt Martha, something inside me broke open. All the power grandmother had taught me to keep hidden came pouring out at once. The men in black coats, the machines, the Hendersons, everything burned except me. The frost on the windows grew thicker, and Joseph could see his own breath in the suddenly frigid air. Emma was losing control again, her emotions, triggering responses that seemed to operate independent of her conscious will. "Look at me," Joseph said firmly. "Emma, look at me." The girl raised her head, and Joseph saw wild panic in her pale blue eyes. The markings on her skin were pulsing rapidly, and the air around her was beginning to shimmer with dangerous energy. "Breathe." "With me," Joseph commanded. He began taking slow, deliberate breaths, the kind his grandmother had taught him for centering meditation. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. Just like this. Emma tried to match his rhythm, her small chest heaving with the effort. Gradually, the temperature in the cabin began to rise, and the frost on the windows started to melt. "Better," Joseph said. "Your grandmother taught you control, didn't she? You just have to remember how to find it again." Emma nodded, wiping her strange tears on her sleeve. "She said I was a bridge between worlds, that my people had been waiting for someone like me for generations. But she also said there would be those who would try to destroy me, because they feared what I represented." "What do you represent?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. When Emma finally answered, her voice carried an authority that seemed far too large for her small body. "Change, the old ways returning. The healing of wounds that have festered for too long." She looked directly at Joseph. "You feel it too, don't you? The way the land calls to you? The way animals trust you without fear? The way you can read the weather in your bones?" Joseph felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. For 20 years, he had convinced himself that the strange abilities he possessed were simply the result of superior observation and wilderness experience. But Emma was stripping away those comfortable lies with the casual ease of someone removing cobwebs. "My grandmother said your people and my people were meant to work together," Emma continued. "That the division between us was artificial, created by those who profit from separation and conflict." Before Joseph could respond, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from outside. Multiple riders, approaching at speed and making no effort at stealth. Joseph moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains he had fashioned from deer hide. 6 men on horseback were riding up the path to his cabin, and Joseph recognized most of them. Samuel Pierce the blacksmith, Henrik Larson, Deputy Marshal Thomas Brennan, and 3 others whose names he didn't know but whose intentions were clear from the weapons they carried. At the head of the group rode a man Joseph had never seen before, tall, pale, wearing a black coat despite the warm weather, with eyes the color of winter ice. "The man in the black coat," Emma whispered from behind him. "He's one of them. One of the hunters." Joseph turned to find Emma pressed against the wall, her face white with terror. The markings on her skin had gone completely dark, as if she was trying to make herself invisible. "Is there another way out?" she asked. Joseph nodded toward a seemingly solid section of the back wall. "Built it myself. Leads to a cave system that opens up near the creek." "But Emma, you can't come with me," she said, and her voice carried a sadness that seemed to contain centuries of loss. "They'll hurt you to get to me. I won't let that happen again." Outside, the riders had reached the front of the cabin. Joseph heard boots hitting the ground, spurs jingling, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. Deputy Marshal Brennan's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Joseph Crow Feather, come out with your hands visible. We know you're harboring the Henderson girl." Joseph looked at Emma, who was already moving toward the hidden door. With movements too quick and sure for a 7-year-old, she pressed her palm against a specific log, and a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a dark passage. "Wait," Joseph said. He moved to a wooden chest beside his bed and removed something wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded the wrapping, Emma saw a necklace of silver and turquoise that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. This belonged To my grandmother, Joseph said, fastening it around Emma's neck. She said it would find its way to someone who needed it more than she did. I think she was talking about you. The moment the necklace touched Emma's skin, the markings on her arms and legs flared with brilliant light. But instead of the pearl-colored glow from before, this light was warm and golden, and it made the strange symbols look like living artwork. It's beautiful, Emma breathed. It's protection, Joseph corrected, and guidance. When you're ready to find your true home, it will show you the way. The pounding on the front door had begun, accompanied by angry shouts. Joseph could hear the man in the black coat giving orders in a voice that carried no warmth or humanity. Go, Joseph said. Follow the passage until you reach the cave with 3 openings. Take the middle one. It leads to a hidden valley where my people once held sacred ceremonies. You'll be safe there until you decide what to do next. Emma stood on her toes and kissed Joseph's cheek. Her lips were warm, and for just a moment, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. Thank you, she said, for seeing me as more than something to be feared. Then she was gone, disappearing into the dark passage like she had never been there at all. The hidden door swung shut behind her, once again appearing to be nothing more than a solid log wall. Joseph took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked to the front door. When he opened it, he found himself facing 6 armed men, and one whose very presence seemed to leach warmth from the air. "Where is she?" the man in the black coat demanded. His voice sounded like winter wind through bare branches. Joseph met the man's cold gaze and spoke his first lie in over a decade. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man smiled, and Joseph felt ice form in his veins. "My name is Agent Marcus Thorne, and I represent certain interests of the federal government. The child you were seen carrying is a dangerous fugitive, responsible for the deaths of 3 innocent people. Harboring her is a federal crime punishable by death." "I saw a scared little girl who needed help," Joseph replied. "I brought her to town. After that, I came home." Agent Thorne stepped closer, and Joseph could see that the man's eyes weren't just pale, they were completely colorless, like looking into deep water on a cloudy day. "Mr. Crowfeather, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is the girl?" Joseph looked at Deputy Marshal Brennan, a man he had known for 5 years and who had always treated him with grudging respect. "Tom, you know me. You know I don't lie." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Joseph, just tell them what they need to know. This is bigger than local law. These federal agents have authority I can't override." "Search the cabin, Agent," Thorne commanded. The men dismounted and pushed past Joseph into his home. They tore through his belongings with systematic efficiency, overturning furniture, emptying drawers, checking every possible hiding place. Joseph watched in silence as they destroyed the life he had built, but his face remained expressionless. After 20 minutes, the searchers emerged empty-handed. Agent Thorne's colorless eyes fixed on Joseph with laser intensity. "She was here," he said. "It wasn't a question. I can smell her otherworldly stench clinging to your clothes." Joseph said nothing. Agent Thorne walked to where Joseph's map covered the back wall. With deliberate malice, he began tearing down the carefully painted symbols, ripping apart generations of accumulated knowledge. "These heathen markings offend God and country," he said conversationally. "But more than that, they represent a way of thinking that has no place in civilized society. The girl you're protecting embodies that same backward thinking. She's a threat to the natural order." Still, Joseph remained silent. Agent Thorne drew a gun from beneath his black coat, not the kind of revolver that frontier lawmen carried, but something mechanical and strange that hummed with barely contained energy. "This is your final opportunity," he said, pressing the weapon against Joseph's temple. "Tell me where she went, and you can live to see another sunrise." Joseph looked at the destroyed remains of his home, at the men who had invaded his sanctuary. and torn apart everything he held dear. Then he looked at Agent Thorne and spoke 2 words in Lakota that his grandmother had taught him long ago. The agent pulled the trigger, and Joseph Crow Feather fell to his knees as strange electricity coursed through his body. But even as pain beyond description racked his frame, he smiled, because in those final moments before consciousness fled, he felt Emma's presence moving safely through the hidden passages, guided by his grandmother's necklace toward a destiny that no government agent could ever understand or control. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of thunder in a cloudless sky. Emma crawled through the narrow passage in complete darkness, her small hands feeling along the rough stone walls for guidance. Joseph's grandmother's necklace cast a soft glow that illuminated just enough space for her to avoid the worst obstacles. But the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. Her knees were scraped raw from the rocky floor, and her dress already torn from the morning's trauma caught repeatedly on jutting stones. The passage finally opened into a cavern large enough for her to stand upright. 3 tunnels branched off from this central chamber, exactly as Joseph had described. Emma touched the necklace, and its glow intensified, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Ancient paintings covered the stone surfaces, buffalo hunts, ceremonial gatherings, and symbols that matched the markings on her own skin. She chose the middle tunnel and began walking, her bare feet silent on the smooth stone floor. This passage sloped steadily upward, and after what felt like hours, she glimpsed daylight ahead. When she finally emerged, Emma found herself in a hidden valley that took her breath away. The valley was perhaps a mile across, completely enclosed by towering cliff walls that made it invisible from the surrounding prairie. A crystal-clear stream meandered through its center, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees whose golden autumn leaves created a canopy of living light. Wild flowers bloomed everywhere, despite the late-season purple asters, yellow goldenrod, and others she didn't recognize that seemed to glow with their own inner radiance. But it was the structures scattered throughout the valley that made Emma gasp. Stone circles marked with the same symbol she bore on her skin dotted the landscape like ancient calendars. A tipi made from white buffalo hide stood near the stream, smoke rising from its peak into the afternoon sky. And everywhere she looked, the very air shimmered with energy that made her markings pulse in response. "You carry the blood of the Star People." Emma spun around to find an elderly Native American woman emerging from behind the tipi. She was ancient, her face lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades spent under sun and wind, but her eyes held a vitality that made her seem ageless. She wore traditional clothing decorated with beadwork and patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than the eye could process. "Don't be afraid, child," the woman said in accented English. "I am Many Voices, keeper of this sacred place. Joseph's grandmother was my sister friend. She told me you might come." Emma's hand went instinctively to the necklace. "You knew White Moon?" Many Voices smiled, and Emma realized that the old woman's teeth were made of silver. White Moon was her white name, chosen to walk among the settlers. Her true name was Singing Starlight, and she was born in the time when the sky spirits still spoke directly to our people. The elderly woman gestured toward the tipi. "Come, you must eat and rest, and then we must speak of serious things. The hunters who pursue you are not ordinary men, and they will not give up easily." Inside the tipi, Emma found warmth that seemed to radiate from the very ground. Soft furs covered the floor, and a small fire burned in the center without smoke or ash. Many Voices ladled soup from a pot that bubbled without any visible heat source, serving it in a bowl carved from white stone that felt warm to the touch. "Drink," Many Voices commanded. "It will help you remember what you have forgotten." The soup tasted like sunlight and growing things, and as Emma drank, she felt strength flowing back into her exhausted body. But more than that, she felt memories. Stirring not her own memories, but older ones that seemed to come from the blood in her veins. "Your mother was one of us," many voices said, settling cross-legged across the fire from Emma. A daughter of the Star People who chose to walk the human world. She fell in love with a white man, a good man who saw her true nature and accepted it without fear. Emma set down the empty bowl. What happened to them? The same thing that happens to all who bridge two worlds. They were hunted by those who profit from separation. Your father died protecting your mother when you were still growing in her womb. Your mother survived long enough to give birth to you, but the effort cost her life. Many voices reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew something that made Emma's breath catch. It was a photograph, old and sepia-toned, showing a woman whose face was hauntingly familiar. She had Emma's pale blue eyes and the same delicate bone structure, but her skin bore intricate markings that covered her entire body like living artwork. This is her, many voices said. Star Dancing Woman, your true mother. The markings you carry are her gift to you, a map of power that connects you to every sacred place on this continent. Emma stared at the photograph, tears streaming down her cheeks. But these tears were different from the crystal ones she had shed at Joseph's cabin. These were warm and salty and entirely human. Why did singing starlight take me away? Because the hunters had found your mother's people and were killing them one by one. Singing starlight was the last of the old guardians, the only one who remembered the ancient protections. She hid you among the white settlers, thinking you would be safer there. Many voices poked at the fire with a stick carved from antler. Sparks rose into the air and formed patterns that looked almost like letters in a language Emma couldn't read. But power like yours cannot be hidden forever. As you grew older, as you approached the age when your true nature would awaken, the hunters began to sense your presence. That is why they came to the Dakota territory. That is why they found you. Emma touched her necklace, feeling its warm pulse against her skin. Agent Thorne said I was an abomination, that I corrupted everything I touched. Agent Thorne represents the Bureau of Anomalous Affairs, a secret government organization dedicated to eliminating anything that challenges their understanding of reality. Many voices' voice carried venom that Emma had never heard from an adult speaking to a child. They call us abominations because we remind them that their world is built on lies about who was here first, lies about what is truly sacred, lies about the nature of power itself. The old woman leaned forward and her eyes began to glow with the same golden light as Emma's necklace. But you, child, are not an abomination. You are evolution. You are the bridge between what was and what could be. Your very existence threatens their carefully maintained order because you prove that their categories are meaningless. Emma felt the markings on her skin beginning to respond to many voices' intensity. They pulsed brighter, and the temperature in the tippy rose noticeably. I don't want to be a bridge, Emma said quietly. I just want to be a normal little girl. Many voices laughed, but it wasn't cruel. It was the laugh of someone who had once felt the same way and learned better through hard experience. Normal is a cage, child. Normal is what they use to keep people small and afraid and manageable. You were born to be extraordinary. Outside the tipi, Emma heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the distant baying of hunting dogs. Many voices heard it too, and her ancient face hardened into plains of granite. They have found the valley, she said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Agent Thorne must have brought trackers men who specialize in hunting our kind. Emma scrambled to her feet, panic rising in her throat. Can we escape through the caves? Not anymore. They will have sealed the tunnels by now. Many voices moved to a wooden chest and began removing items that made Emma's skin crawl with recognition. Ceremonial objects that seemed to bend light around themselves, weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Then what do we do? Many voices turned to face her, and Emma saw something in the old woman's eyes that was older than mountains and harder than diamonds. We make our stand. We show them what happens when you corner the children of the stars. The baying of the dogs was getting closer, and Emma could hear voices echoing off the valley walls. Agent Thorne's cold commands mixed with the rougher shouts of his hired men. Many voices handed Emma a staff carved from wood so white it seemed to glow from within. "This was your mother's," she said. "It will amplify your natural abilities and help you focus your power. But remember, power without wisdom is destruction. You must choose carefully how you use what you have been given." Emma gripped the staff and immediately felt energy coursing through it like electricity through copper wire. The markings on her skin flared to brilliant life, and she realized that for the first time since the terrible morning at the Henderson farm, she felt complete. "There!" Agent Thorne's voice echoed across the valley. "The child is there." Emma looked through the tipi's entrance and saw men emerging from concealment all around the valley's rim. They rappelled down the cliff faces on ropes, at least 20 of them, all wearing the same black uniforms and carrying weapons that sparked with unnatural energy. "So many," Emma whispered. "They fear you," many voices replied, picking up a war club studded with stones that looked like captured starlight. "Fear makes them bring overwhelming force against a 7-year-old child. But fear also makes them stupid." Agent Thorne's amplified voice boomed across the valley. "Star Dancing Woman's daughter, you are surrounded. Come out peacefully, and your death will be quick." Many voices spat into the fire, causing it to flare bright blue. Peaceful death. As if such a thing were possible. For our people at their hands. Emma stepped outside the tipi, staff in hand, and felt the afternoon sun warm her face. The hunters had formed a circle around the valley floor, their strange weapons aimed at her small form. At their head stood Agent Thorne, his colorless eyes reflecting the light like ice. "Child," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You have caused enough death and destruction. End this now, and spare the old woman." Emma looked at many voices who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at Agent Thorne and spoke in a voice that carried far more authority than any 7-year-old should possess. "I am Emma Starburn, daughter of Star Dancing Woman, granddaughter of Singing Starlight, child of 2 worlds and heir to powers you cannot comprehend. You have murdered my family, destroyed my homes, and hunted me like an animal. Now face the consequences." She raised her mother's staff above her head, and every flower in the valley burst into flames. But these weren't ordinary flames. They were cold fire, blue-white energy that burned without consuming, light that carved shadows from the very air. The stone circles around the valley began to glow, and Emma realized they weren't just ceremonial markers, they were focusing lenses, designed to channel and amplify the natural energies that flowed through this sacred place. Agent Thorne shouted orders, and his men opened fire with their strange weapons. Bolts of crackling energy lanced toward Emma from every direction. But they struck an invisible barrier and dissipated harmlessly. Emma had become a living conduit for the valley's power, and that power was vast beyond imagining. Many voices began to chant in a language that predated European contact by millennia. As her voice rose and fell, the very stones beneath their feet began to sing in response. Emma felt the song resonate in her bones, in the markings on her skin, in the spaces between her heartbeats. This was what she had been born for. Not to hide among the settlers, not to pretend to be something she wasn't, but to stand at the crossroads between worlds and defend what was sacred against those who would destroy it. The cold fire spread outward from Emma in concentric circles, and wherever it touched, the valley's true nature was revealed. The grass became silver, the stream turned to flowing starlight, and the air itself took on weight and substance. This wasn't the ordinary world anymore. This was the place between places, where the old powers still held sway. Agent Thorne's men began to scream as their weapons malfunctioned, overloaded by energies they had no training to handle. Several of them fell to their knees, overwhelmed by visions of what the continent had looked like before their ancestors arrived. Others simply fled, unable to cope with the revelation that everything they had been taught about reality was a carefully constructed lie. But Agent Thorne himself stood firm, his colorless eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that bordered on madness. He reached inside his black coat and withdrew something that made many voices gasp in horror, a blade forged from metal that seemed to absorb light, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Iron from the heart of a fallen star," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the transformed valley. "Blessed by priests who understand the true nature of order. This blade was made specifically to kill your kind, child. It will cut through your protections like they were spider webs." Emma felt ice forming in her veins as Agent Thorne began walking toward her across the silver grass. The blade in his hand pulsed with malevolent energy that made her markings dim and her connection to the valley's power waver. "Run," many voices whispered urgently. "That blade can kill even one such as you. Run now while you still can." But Emma stood her ground, gripping her mother's staff tighter. She thought of Joseph's sacrifice, of the Hendersons' kindness, of Singing Starlight's love. Too many people had already paid the price for her existence. "No more running," she said quietly. Then she raised the staff and called upon powers that had slept in her bloodline for generations, preparing to make a stand that would be remembered long after the last government agent had turned to dust. Star-forged blade cut through Emma's protective barrier like it was made of morning mist. Agent Thorne advanced steadily across the transformed valley, his colorless eyes fixed on her with predatory focus. With each step he took, the silver grass withered beneath his feet, leaving tracks of ordinary brown earth in his wake. Emma raised her mother's staff higher, channeling every ounce of power she could draw from the sacred valley. The stone circles blazed with ancient energy, and the very air crackled with electricity that made her hair stand on end. But the blade in Thorne's hand seemed to create a void around itself, a sphere of nothingness that devoured light and hope in equal measure. "You cannot comprehend the forces you meddle with, child," Thorne called out, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to press against Emma's mind. "This valley, these so-called sacred places, they are wounds in reality itself. Tears in the natural order that allow chaos to seep into our world." Many voices stepped forward, her war club glowing with captured starlight. "You speak of order, but you serve only destruction. Your kind has spent centuries trying to erase what you cannot understand." Thorne's attention shifted to the elderly woman, and Emma saw something flicker across his face, not quite recognition, but a familiarity that suggested their paths had crossed before. "Ah yes, the last guardian. I wondered if you were still alive." Thorne's smile was colder than winter wind. "Do you remember St. Louis, old woman, 1863? You were much younger then, but just as foolish." Many voices' face went white, and her grip on the war club tightened until her knuckles showed pale against her weathered skin. "You were there, at the massacre. I was newly recruited to the Bureau then, eager to prove myself. Tracking down your little community of half-breeds and sympathizers was my first major assignment." Thorne's voice carried a nostalgic warmth that made Emma's skin crawl. 47 confirmed eliminations in a single night. Women, children, elders, it didn't matter. They all carried the taint. Emma felt rage building in her chest like a physical pressure. The markings on her skin blazed brighter, and the temperature in the valley began to rise. Around the rim of the cliffs, Thorne's remaining men backed away from their positions as the very stone began to glow with heat. "You're a monster," Emma said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I'm a patriot," Thorne replied calmly. "I serve the natural order, the way things were meant to be before your kind corrupted the world with your unnatural abilities. America was destined to be a nation of ordinary humans, governed by rational thought and Christian values. Your people represent everything that stands in the way of that destiny. He was close enough now that Emma could see the details of the star-forged blade. It was covered in symbols that hurt to look at, carved with the kind of precision that spoke of obsessive devotion to destruction. But more disturbing were the stains along its edge, dark patches that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. How many? Emma asked quietly. Thorne understood immediately. In 24 years of service to the Bureau, 1,347 confirmed eliminations. Men, women, children, anyone who carried even a trace of otherworldly power. He paused, studying Emma's face. You'll be 1,348. Many voices let out a war cry that echoed off the valley walls like thunder, raising her club and charging toward Thorne with surprising speed for someone her age. But the agent simply turned and swept the star-forged blade in a casual arc. It passed through Many Voices' torso without resistance, and she collapsed to the silver grass, her ancient eyes wide with shock. No! Emma screamed, and the sound shattered every piece of glass within 50 miles. The remaining agents on the cliff rim were thrown backward by the force of her cry, several of them tumbling over the edge into the transformed valley below. The stone circles around the perimeter exploded into fragments of singing crystal, and the cottonwood trees burst into pillars of blue flame that reached toward the sky like prayers made visible. Thorne staggered but kept his footing, the star-forged blade creating a protective zone around him that deflected the worst of Emma's unleashed grief. When the echoes died away, he looked down at Many Voices' still form with satisfaction. Touching, he said, but ultimately pointless. Your guardian is dead, child. Your protector sacrificed himself for nothing. You are alone, just as your kind was always meant to be. Emma knelt beside Many Voices, tears streaming down her face. But as her tears fell onto the old woman's weathered skin, something extraordinary happened. The crystal drops sank into Many Voices' flesh like water into thirsty earth, and the terrible wound across her torso began to close. Impossible, Thorne breathed. Many Voices' eyes fluttered open, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of mountains. Not impossible, inevitable. The child has awakened to her true heritage. She sat up slowly, the star-forged blade's wound completely healed. Emma could see that the old woman's skin now bore markings similar to her own spiraling patterns that pulsed with inner light. The tears of the star people can heal any wound, Many Voices explained, rising to her feet with renewed vitality. But more than that, they can awaken dormant bloodlines, calling forth power that has slept for generations. Around the valley, Emma could see the effects of her transformed tears spreading. Where they had fallen on the grass, new flowers bloomed not. Ordinary wildflowers, but blossoms that seemed to be made of condensed starlight. Where they had touched the stone circles, new symbols appeared, glowing with ancient power that made the air itself sing. Thorne's composure cracked for the first time. This changes nothing. The blade can still kill you, regardless of what parlor tricks you've learned. But Emma was no longer listening to him. She was listening to something else, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A harmony that resonated in her bones and made her markings pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Do you hear that? She asked Many Voices. The elderly woman tilted her head, and a smile spread across her face. The awakening song, its beginning. Across the valley, the ground began to tremble. Not the violent shaking of an earthquake, but a deeper vibration, as if the earth itself was stirring from a long sleep. Cracks appeared in the soil, but instead of revealing darkness beneath, they glowed with the same golden light as Emma's necklace. What's happening? Thorne demanded, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine alarm. You wanted to eliminate the taint, Many Voices said, her voice carrying a joy that seemed to encompass centuries of hidden hope. But you never understood what the taint actually was. It wasn't corruption, Agent Thorne. It was seeds. Seeds. Planted long ago by those who knew that someday the world would be ready for harvest. The cracks in the earth widened, and from them emerged things that made Thorne's remaining men scream in terror. Not monsters or demons, but beings of pure light that moved with grace beyond human comprehension. They looked like people men, and women of various ages, but their skin bore the same spiraling markings as Emma's, and their eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom accumulated over millennia. The first people, many voices whispered. Those who came before, who have been waiting in the spaces between worlds for the bridge to call them home. Emma felt recognition flood through her as she looked at the emerging figures. These weren't strangers, they were family. Ancestors whose blood ran in her veins, whose memories lived in her cells, whose love had sustained her through every moment of fear and loneliness. At the head of the group walked a woman whose face Emma recognized from the photograph many voices had shown her. But this wasn't a sepia-toned image. This was her mother, Star-Dancing Woman, alive and radiant with power that made the afternoon sun seem dim by comparison. "My daughter," Star-Dancing Woman said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. "You have grown beautiful." Emma ran to her mother's arms, feeling complete for the first time in her short life. Star-Dancing Woman embraced her, and where their skin touched, new constellations bloomed in the air around them. "This is impossible," Thorne said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "The dead cannot return. Reality doesn't work that way." Star-Dancing Woman looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only profound sadness. "Reality is far more flexible than your kind believes, Agent Thorne. Death is simply another country, and the borders between countries can be crossed by those who know the way." More figures emerged from the glowing cracks, warriors and healers, artists and dreamers, all bearing the marks of the Star People. They moved with purpose across the transformed valley, each one taking a position that seemed to have been predetermined long ago. Thorne raised the star-forged blade, but his hand was shaking now. "I won't let you corrupt this world any further. I'll destroy you all, even if it costs me my life." "You cannot destroy what was never separate from the world to begin with," Star-Dancing Woman replied gently. "We are not invaders, Agent Thorne. We are the world remembering what it was before fear divided it into categories." The agent lunged forward, swinging the blade in a desperate arc toward Emma's mother. But before it could connect, another figure stepped between them, Joseph Crowfeather, his chest bearing the electrical burns from Thorne's weapon, but his eyes blazing with life renewed. Joseph caught Thorne's wrist with one hand, stopping the blade's descent with casual ease. "You shot me for protecting a child," he said quietly. "Now face the consequences." The star-forged blade began to smoke in Thorne's grip, its metal heating rapidly as Joseph's power flowed through the point of contact. Within seconds, the weapon was glowing red-hot, and Thorne was forced to drop it with a cry of pain. The moment the blade hit the ground, it began to dissolve, its star-forged metal unable to maintain coherence in the presence of so much concentrated life force. The dark symbols carved into its surface writhed like living things before finally dissolving into harmless smoke. Thorne fell to his knees, staring at his burned hand in disbelief. Around the valley's rim, his remaining agents were fleeing, unable to cope with the revelation that everything they had been taught about reality was wrong. "It's over," Emma said, though she spoke with her mother's voice now, harmonics layering upon harmonics until her words seemed to come from the earth itself. "The age of hiding is finished. The age of division is ending. The age of integration has begun." Star-Dancing Woman placed her hand on Emma's shoulder, and Emma felt power flowing between them, not just her mother's power, but the accumulated strength of generations stretching back to the first people who had looked up at the stars and understood that they were not separate from the cosmos but part of its eternal dance. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now," said a familiar voice, "we rebuild." Emma turned to see singing starlight emerging from the crowd of returned ancestors, her face radiant with joy and pride. "We rebuild the connections that were severed, heal the wounds that were opened, restore the balance that was lost." Across the valley, the transformation continued. The silver grass was spreading beyond the valley's boundaries, following ley lines that connected sacred sites across the entire continent. The golden light emanating from the stone circles was growing brighter, visible even in the afternoon sun. "The network is awakening," many voices explained, her own marking now glowing in harmony with the others. "Every sacred site, every place of power that your people tried to destroy or desecrate, they're all coming back online." Emma could feel it happening, a vast web of energy spanning the continent, connecting mountains and rivers, forests and plains, in a pattern of such complexity and beauty that it took her breath away. This was what her people had built before the coming of those who sought to divide and conquer. This was the true map of the land, drawn not in borders and property lines, but in flows of living energy. Agent Thorne struggled to his feet, his burned hand clutched against his chest. "You don't understand what you've done. The government will never allow this. They'll send the military, use nuclear weapons if they have to. They'll destroy everything rather than let you change the world." Star-dancing woman looked at him with compassion that seemed too large for any human heart. "Let them try," she said softly. "We are not separate from the world, Agent Thorne. We are the world awakening to its true nature. You cannot destroy us without destroying everything you claim to protect." As if to illustrate her point, the golden light from the stone circles suddenly intensified, shooting skyward in pillars that could be seen from hundreds of miles away. Across the continent, similar lights were appearing as ancient sites responded to the awakening call. Emma felt herself changing, growing, becoming something larger than the frightened little girl who had stumbled into Millbrook that morning. She was still herself, but she was also every person who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos. She was the bridge between worlds, the living proof that separation was an illusion. "Come," Star-dancing woman said, extending her hand toward Agent Thorne. "The old ways are ending, but that doesn't mean you have to end with them. There's a place for everyone in the world that's coming." Thorne stared at the offered hand, his colorless eyes reflecting depths of confusion and loss. For just a moment, Emma saw him as he truly was, not a monster, but a man who had been taught to fear everything that made life beautiful and mysterious. But the moment passed, and Thorne's face hardened back into planes of rigid certainty. "I'd rather die than live in a world ruled by abominations." He pulled a small device from his coat, some kind of communicator, and spoke into it with desperate intensity. "This is Agent Thorne requesting an immediate nuclear strike on coordinates ... He rattled off the valley's location, his voice rising with hysteria. "Authorization Omega Black. Repeat, authorization Omega Black." The device crackled with static for a moment, then fell silent. Thorne shook it frantically, but no response came. "I'm sorry," Joseph said quietly, "but the old networks are offline now. The world is changing, and there's no calling back the forces that used to enforce artificial divisions." Emma stepped forward, her small hand glowing with power that could have leveled mountains. "You have a choice, Agent Thorne. You can let go of your fear and help us build something better, or you can cling to hatred until it consumes you completely. But either way, the world is changing. The only question is whether you'll be part of the healing or part of the wound." Agent Marcus Thorne looked around the transformed valley, at the beings of light who watched him with patience beyond human understanding, at the child whose very existence had shattered his carefully ordered worldview. Then he closed his colorless eyes and made the choice that would define not just his own fate, but the future of everything he had once believed in. Agent Thorne opened his eyes, and for the first time since Emma had met him, they weren't colorless. Instead, They held flecks of brown and gold, as if his humanity was slowly seeping back through cracks in the ice that had encased his soul for decades. "I don't know how," he whispered, looking at his burned hand. The flesh was healing before their eyes, not through Emma's tears this time, but through his own body's sudden remembrance of what it meant to be whole. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." Star-dancing woman approached him, slowly, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to walk between worlds. "What you are is not what you've been made to believe you are. The Bureau didn't recruit you, Marcus Thorne. They captured you." Thorne's head snapped up, confusion and denial warring across his features. "That's impossible." "I volunteered. I believed in the mission." "You were 7 years old when they found you," Star-dancing woman continued, her voice carrying the gentle inevitability of truth finally spoken. "Living with your grandmother in the mountains of Colorado, learning the old ways she remembered from her Cherokee mother. You could speak to animals then, could feel the rhythm of the earth in your bones." Emma watched as Thorne's face went through a series of transformations, memory and conditioning battling for control. She could see flashes of the child he had been, a boy with dark hair and wondering eyes who had once sat by mountain streams and listened to the songs that stones sang. "They told me my grandmother was dead," Thorne said slowly. "That she died in a fire, that I was the only survivor." "She was very much alive when they took you," Joseph said, stepping forward. His voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to read truth in the spaces between words. Crying wolf woman, she spent the rest of her life searching for her stolen grandson, traveling from reservation to reservation, asking if anyone had seen a boy with eyes that changed color with his moods. Thorne staggered backward, his carefully constructed identity crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. No, that's not. I remember the training. The indoctrination centers. They saved me from a life of primitive superstition. They broke you, many voices said, but her voice held compassion rather than accusation. Broke you so thoroughly that you became their perfect weapon, someone with natural sensitivity to our kind, but turned completely against his own heritage. Emma felt something stirring in the air around them, a presence that seemed vast and ancient and deeply familiar. The returned ancestors were gathering in a circle around Thorne, but their stance wasn't threatening. Instead, they stood like a healing circle, offering their combined strength to help undo decades of carefully inflicted damage. "Let us show you," Singing Starlight said, extending her weathered hand toward Thorne. "Let us show you who you were, before they taught you to hate yourself." Thorne looked at the offered hand with the expression of someone being offered salvation and damnation in the same gesture. Emma could see the war raging inside him, 24 years of conditioning, against the growing whisper of recovered memory. "If I was like you," he said finally, "if I had your abilities, why couldn't I sense it? Why didn't I know?" "Because they used technology stolen from our people to bind your natural gifts," Star-dancing woman explained. "Devices that created feedback loops in your neural pathways, making you experience your own power as pain and revulsion. Every time your true nature tried to surface, it was met with agony so intense that your mind learned to suppress it completely." Emma remembered the strange weapons Thorne's men had carried, the way they hummed with unnatural energy. "The guns, the machines, they're built from your people's knowledge. Knowledge stolen from sites we considered sacred, twisted into tools of oppression and control." Star-dancing woman's expression darkened with centuries of accumulated grief. "They've been strip mining our culture for decades, taking what serves their purposes and destroying the rest." Thorne fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation. 1,347 people. I killed 1,347 people who were like me. "No," said a new voice, and Emma turned to see another figure emerging from the golden light. This one was different from the others, younger, wearing clothes that seemed to shift between traditional Native American dress and modern military. Fatigues. You killed 1,346. I survived. Thorne's face went white as he recognized the newcomer, Thomas Windwalker. But I shot you myself. Point-blank range with a neural disruptor. I watched you die. You watched me appear to die, Thomas corrected, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But my grandmother had taught me the old tricks before your people found me. Death is negotiable when you know the right words to speak. Thomas knelt beside Thorne, and Emma could see that his skin bore markings similar to her own, but fainter, as if they had been suppressed for so long. They were only just beginning to remember how to shine. I spent 3 years tracking you after that, Thomas continued. Planning my revenge, gathering allies, preparing to make you pay for all the families you destroyed. But then I learned the truth about what they'd done to you, and revenge stopped making sense. He placed his hand on Thorne's shoulder, and Emma saw light pass between them, not the harsh glare of judgment, but the warm glow of understanding. You were as much their victim as any of us. More, in some ways, because they made you complicit in your own people's destruction. Thorne began to weep, and his tears were at the crystal droplets of the Star People, but ordinary salt water that spoke of purely human grief. How do I live with what I've done? How do I find redemption for that much blood? The same way any of us find redemption, many voices said gently. One choice at a time. One moment of choosing love over fear, connection over separation. Emma felt the great network of energy that was spreading across the continent pulse with new intensity. She could sense sacred sites awakening from coast to coast, ancient circles in Maine, medicine wheels in Montana, cliff dwellings in Colorado. Each one coming online, adding its voice to a chorus that had been silent for far too long. But she could also sense resistance. In Washington, D.C., in military installations across the country, in corporate boardrooms where profit margins were discussed with religious fervor, powerful people were realizing that their carefully maintained control was slipping away. They're mobilizing, she said, her young voice carrying the weight of prophecy. The government, the military, the corporations. They can't stop the awakening, but they're going to try to contain it. Star-dancing woman nodded grimly. They'll declare martial law, create quarantine zones around the awakened sites. They'll try to paint this as a terrorist attack, a foreign invasion, anything that allows them to respond with overwhelming force. Let them come, Joseph said, but his voice held sadness rather than anger. Violence is the only language they understand, but it's a language that's becoming obsolete. Emma looked around the transformed valley, at the beings of light who had returned to help heal the world's wounds, at Agent Thorne who was slowly remembering how to be human. An idea began to form in her mind, something so audacious and beautiful that it took her breath away. What if we don't fight them? She said suddenly. What if we show them instead? Star-dancing woman raised an eyebrow. Show them what, my daughter? What? The world could be like if we worked together instead of against each other. What if every person who receives the awakening call doesn't resist or hide, but openly demonstrates what their gifts can do to heal the world? Emma gestured toward the valley's entrance, where the effects of the transformation were already spreading beyond its boundaries. Where her power had touched the land, everything was more vibrant, more alive. Plants grew stronger, water ran cleaner, even the soil seemed to hum with renewed vitality. Imagine if this happened everywhere, she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. If every awakened person used their abilities not for conquest or control, but for healing. Cleaning polluted rivers, restoring damaged ecosystems, helping crops grow in barren soil. Thomas Windwalker stood up, understanding dawning in his eyes. They can't fight a revolution that improves everything it touches. They can't declare war on people who are making the world objectively better. They can try, Agent Thorne said. his voice hoarse from weeping but carrying a new kind of strength. "I know how they think. They'll find a way to spin it as dangerous, as a threat to natural order." "Then we make it impossible to spin," Emma replied. "We be so obviously beneficial, so clearly healing, that even their propaganda can't hide the truth." Singing Starlight stepped forward, her ancient face glowing with pride. "The child speaks wisdom. This is what we always intended, not conquest, but collaboration. Not replacement, but integration." Emma felt the network of sacred sites responding to her words, their energy output increasing as if they too understood the plan taking shape. Across the continent, people were waking up to abilities they'd never known they possessed. Most were frightened, confused, trying to hide what was happening to them. But what if they didn't have to hide? "We need teachers," she realized aloud. "People who can help the newly awakened understand their gifts and use them responsibly." "We need protectors too," Joseph added. "Those who can stand between the awakened and the forces that would try to destroy them." "We need translators," Thomas said. "People who can speak both languages, the old ways and the new world, and help them understand each other." Emma turned to Agent Thorne, who was slowly getting to his feet. His colorless eyes now held clear blue at their centers, as if his true self was swimming up from depths where it had been submerged for decades. "We need someone who understands the enemy," she said quietly. "Someone who knows how they think, how they operate, how they can be reached." Thorne met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not the cold instrument of destruction who had hunted her, but the confused little boy who had been stolen from his grandmother's love and twisted into something he was never meant to be. "I know their procedures, their protocols, their weaknesses," he said slowly. "I know which agents might be open to reason and which are too far gone to save. I know where they keep the stolen artifacts and how they've weaponized our own wisdom against us." "Then help us," Emma said simply. "Help us save them from themselves." The golden light emanating from the stone circle suddenly intensified, and Emma realized that the network was responding not just to their words, but to the intention behind them. The energy that was awakening across the continent could sense that the plan had changed from resistance to integration, from conflict to healing. "It's working," many voices whispered in amazement. "The sites are responding to the new paradigm. They're shifting from defensive positions to collaborative ones." Emma could feel it too, thousands of newly awakened people across the country, suddenly feeling less afraid, more hopeful. The panic that had been building as their abilities manifested was being replaced by curiosity and wonder. Instead of hiding their gifts, they were beginning to explore them. In a small town in Oregon, a woman who had been terrified by her sudden ability to communicate with plants was now helping her neighbor's dying garden bloom again. In downtown Chicago, a man whose newfound empathy had been overwhelming him was learning to use it to diffuse conflicts and bring peace to troubled situations. In rural Texas, a teenager whose touch could purify water was quietly fixing the contaminated well that had poisoned her community. "They're not waiting for permission," Star Dancing Woman observed with satisfaction. "They're simply doing what feels right." Emma felt tears of joy streaming down her face, normal, salty tears that spoke of human happiness rather than supernatural transformation. "It's beautiful. They're all so beautiful." But even as hope blossomed in her chest, she could sense the darker currents flowing beneath the surface. Military units were being mobilized. Emergency protocols were being activated. In secure facilities across the country, scientists and strategists were working around the clock to develop countermeasures against what they saw as an existential threat. "They're coming," Agent Thorne said, his reawakened senses allowing him to read the electromagnetic signatures of approaching aircraft. Full military response. "They'll be here within the hour." Emma looked around the valley at the people she had come to think of as family, her mother and grandmother, Joseph, who had sacrificed everything to protect her, Many voices who had shown her the truth of her heritage, Thomas who had chosen forgiveness over revenge, and even Agent Thorne who was struggling to rediscover his own humanity. "Then we'd better be ready to show them something they've never seen before," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of destiny. "We'd better be ready to show them what the future looks like." She raised her mother's staff above her head, and every awakened person within 1,000 miles felt the call echo in their bones. Not a call to battle, but a call to witness. A call to stand together and demonstrate that the age of separation was ending, and the age of integration had begun. The golden light from the stone circles shot skyward in pillars that could be seen from orbit, and across the continent. Similar lights blazed into existence as the network reached full activation for the first time in centuries. The world was changing, and there was no force on Earth that could change it back. The sound of military helicopters filled the afternoon sky like mechanical thunder, their rotors churning the golden light that emanated from the sacred valley. Emma stood at the center of the stone circle, her mother's staff glowing with power that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Around her, the returned ancestors maintained their protective formation, but their stance spoke of readiness to heal rather than destroy. General Patricia Hawthorne stepped out of the lead helicopter before it had fully landed, her crisp uniform and steel-gray hair speaking of decades spent enforcing order through superior firepower. She surveyed the transformed landscape with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to see everything as either an asset or a threat, and Emma could tell which category this valley fell into. "Agent Thorne," the general called out her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Stand down and report your status immediately." Thorne emerged from behind the tipi, but he moved with none of his former predatory grace. Instead, he walked like someone learning to inhabit his own skin again, each step tentative and deliberate. The burned hand he had hidden inside his coat was now completely healed, and his eyes held depths that hadn't been there hours before. "General Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate with the transformed air around them. "I'm afraid my status has evolved." The general's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm, reading the change in her former agent with the skill of someone who had survived 3 wars by trusting her instincts. "You've been compromised. Stand aside so we can contain this situation." "There's nothing to contain," Emma said, stepping forward. Despite her small stature, her presence seemed to fill the entire valley. "There's only something to understand." General Hawthorne's attention snapped to Emma, and the child could see recognition dawning in the older woman's eyes. This wasn't the first time the general had encountered someone like her. "Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne," Star-Dancing Woman said softly, and the general's face went white. "You were 12 when they took you from the Crow Reservation. Your grandmother Winter Hawk spent 7 years trying to find you before the grief killed her." The general's composed facade cracked like ice under spring pressure. "That's classified information." "How could you possibly?" "Because I was there," Star-Dancing Woman continued, her voice carrying the patient certainty of someone sharing the inevitable truth. "I helped Winter Hawk search every boarding school, every military academy, every government facility that specialized in special children. We never found you, but we never stopped looking." Emma could see the battle raging behind General Hawthorne's eyes, decades of military conditioning against the sudden awakening of carefully buried memories. The woman who had built her career on absolute control was discovering that the foundation of her identity had been constructed on lies. "The Carlisle Institute," the general whispered, naming a place that had been officially closed for decades. "They said my parents were dead, that the reservation was diseased, that they were saving me from a life of poverty and ignorance." "Your parents died looking for you," many voices said gently. "They never stopped believing you were alive somewhere, calling out for them to come home." Around the valley's perimeter, Emma could see soldiers taking defensive positions, their Weapons trained on the group of apparent civilians who somehow radiated more threat than entire enemy divisions. But she could also see confusion in their ranks. Career military personnel struggling to understand why their equipment was malfunctioning in the presence of so much concentrated life force. "Ma'am," a young lieutenant called out from behind. "The general, our targeting systems are offline. Radio communications are intermittent. Something's interfering with our electronics." General Hawthorne looked around the transformed valley, taking in the beings of light who stood watching with patient eyes. The grass that seemed to glow with inner radiance, the very air that shimmered with energy that made conventional physics look like a rough approximation of reality. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her military training asserting itself over the chaos of recovered memory. "We want to go home," Emma said simply. "All of us. We want to stop pretending that we're separate from each other, separate from the land, separate from the forces that created us. We want to remember what we were before fear taught us to forget." The general gestured toward the military force arrayed around the valley. "You're surrounded by enough firepower to level this entire area. Even if your abilities are real, you can't fight the combined might of the United States military." "We don't want to fight anyone," Joseph said, stepping forward with the quiet dignity that had always marked his presence. "We want to heal the wounds that make fighting seem necessary." "Impossible," General Hawthorne snapped, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "The security of the nation depends on maintaining clear distinctions between normal and abnormal, between citizen and threat." Emma felt the continental network of sacred sites pulsing in harmony around her, thousands of points of light connected by streams of energy that flowed like rivers of liquid starlight. Through this network, she could sense the awakening spreading, not as conquest or infection, but as remembrance. "Show her," Star Dancing Woman suggested. "Show her what the world looks like when the artificial boundaries dissolve." Emma nodded and raised her mother's staff. Instead of directing its power at the military forces surrounding them, she sent it deep into the earth, following the ley lines that connected sacred sites across the entire continent. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every awakened person within 1,000 miles suddenly found their abilities amplified beyond anything they had experienced before. But instead of using this power for personal gain or protection, they instinctively turned it toward healing. In Detroit, a man whose touch could restore mechanical systems began repairing the abandoned factories that had once been the heart of American manufacturing, but now he understood how to make them work in harmony with living systems, rather than in opposition to them. In the Everglades, a woman whose consciousness could merge with plant network started reversing decades of environmental damage, teaching invasive species to coexist with native flora instead of destroying it. In Los Angeles, a teenager whose empathic abilities had always been overwhelming learned to use them to heal the psychological trauma that manifested as gang violence and addiction, bringing peace to neighborhoods that had known only conflict for generations. Effect cascaded across the continent like a wave of pure possibility, and Emma could see the military personnel around the valley watching their communications equipment as reports flooded in from across the country. But these weren't reports of destruction or chaos, they were reports of miracles. "This is impossible," General Hawthorne said, but she was reading the same reports, watching the same data streams that showed environmental restoration happening in real time, crime rates plummeting as communities rediscovered their capacity for mutual support, technological innovations emerging that seemed to violate everything science thought it knew about the laws of physics. "It's inevitable," Agent Thorne corrected, and Emma could hear his true name, Marcus Crowfeather, beginning to surface in his voice. "This is what we were always meant to become. What we were before they taught us to be afraid of our own potential." Emma felt a new presence entering the valley, and she turned to see helicopters with different markings landing near the military formation. These carried not soldiers but civilian scientists, Doctors, engineers, and others whose life's work had been dedicated to understanding the world rather than controlling it. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was the first to approach, her eyes wide with wonder as she took readings from instruments that were registering energy signatures they had never been designed to detect. Emma recognized her from news reports, a quantum physicist whose theories about parallel dimensions had been considered fringe science until this moment. The energy patterns are unprecedented, Dr. Martinez breathed, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own senses. The electromagnetic field generated by this valley is somehow increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis in surrounding plant life by 300%. More scientists joined her, each one confirming what their instruments were telling them, but struggling to integrate the data with their existing understanding of reality. Emma could see the exact moment when each one made the leap from skepticism to wonder, when they realized they were witnessing not the breakdown of natural law but its expansion into territories that human science had never imagined. General, Dr. Martinez said, her voice shaking with excitement, if these effects could be replicated, if we could understand the mechanism behind them, we could solve climate change within a decade. We could end scarcity, restore damaged ecosystems maybe, even reverse aging. General Hawthorne looked from the scientists to the military personnel, who were reporting equipment failures that seemed to indicate their weapons were being systematically neutralized by proximity to so much concentrated life force. Then she looked at Emma, seeing not a threat to be contained, but a 7-year-old child who carried the future of human evolution in her genetic code. What guarantees do we have? The general asked finally. How do we know this power won't be used against us? Emma stepped forward, extending her small hand toward the woman who had once been a frightened crow girl named Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne. The same guarantee you had when you were 12 years old and dreaming of flying like the eagles your grandmother showed you. The guarantee that love is stronger than fear, that healing is more powerful than destruction, that we're all part of the same story. General Hawthorne stared at Emma's outstretched hand for a long moment, decades of military conditioning warring with memories that had been buried but never truly forgotten. Around the valley, hundreds of soldiers watched their commanding officer face a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of human civilization. Slowly, carefully, General Hawthorne reached out and took Emma's hand. The moment their skin made contact, light exploded across the valley, not the harsh glare of weapons or technology, but the warm radiance of connection finally restored. Emma felt the general's true self awakening, remembered the child who had once been able to speak with animals and feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet. I remember, General Hawthorne whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. I remember who I was before they taught me to forget. The transformation spread through the military ranks like ripples in a pond. Soldiers who had been trained to see everything in terms of conflict and control suddenly remembered what it felt like to be children who had wondered about the stars, who had felt connected to something larger than themselves, who had believed that the world was fundamentally good. Weapons were lowered not through command, but through choice. Communication equipment came back online, but instead of reporting threats to be neutralized, the soldiers found themselves describing scenes of unprecedented cooperation and healing happening across the continent. Emma released General Hawthorne's hand and stepped back, surveying the transformed scene around her. The military force that had come to destroy the awakening had instead become part of it, their presence adding to the web of connection that was spreading across the country like dawn breaking over a new world. What happens now? Agent Thorne asked, though Emma could hear that he was already beginning to think of himself by his true name again. Now we build, Emma said, her young voice carrying the authority of someone who had looked into the heart of creation and understood its fundamental nature. We build bridges between worlds that were never meant to be separate. We build communities where everyone's gifts are valued. We build a future where children don't have to hide who they really are." Star-dancing woman placed her hand on Emma's shoulder, and mother and daughter stood together at the center of a transformation that would echo across generations. The age of hiding is over. The age of integration has begun. As the sun set over the Dakota Territory, painting the sky in colors that seemed to echo the golden light emanating from the sacred valley, Emma looked out at a world that was remembering how to be whole again. The network of awakened sights stretched from coast to coast, a living web of connection that proved what her people had always known, that everything was related. Everything was sacred. Everything was part of the same eternal dance between earth and sky, matter and spirit, fear and love. In the distance, she could see other lights beginning to shine, not just in North America, but around the globe, as sacred sites that had been dormant for centuries responded to the awakening call. Stonehenge blazed with ancient power. Uluru sang with the voices of the first people. Mount Fuji became a beacon visible from space. The pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Angkor Wat joined their voices to a chorus that spanned continents and cultures. Humanity was remembering what it had forgotten, and the world was preparing to welcome home all its lost children. Emma smiled and took her mother's hand, ready to help build whatever came next. The silent Lakota brave who had carried her to safety was no longer silent, and she was no longer the frightened child who had needed carrying. Together, they would teach the world a new song, the song of integration, of healing, of coming home to the truth that had always been waiting in the space between heartbeats. The future had arrived, and it was more beautiful than anyone had dared to dream. 5 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the new settlement that had grown around the sacred valley, its adobe buildings and solar collectors forming a harmonious blend of ancient wisdom and modern innovation. Children's laughter echoed from the school, where lessons in quantum physics were taught alongside traditional plant medicine, where computer programming shared classroom space with animal communication workshops. Emma Starburn, she had legally reclaimed her true name on her 13th birthday, stood on the hill overlooking what the residents simply called the village. She was taller now, her pale blue eyes holding depths of experience that spoke of someone who had walked between worlds and learned to call both home. The markings on her skin had evolved too, becoming more intricate as her abilities grew, flowing patterns that seemed to shift and dance with her emotions. "Hard to believe it's only been 5 years," said Marcus Crowfeather, joining her on the hilltop. The man who had once been Agent Thorne looked nothing like the cold hunter who had pursued a frightened child across the Dakota Territory. His hair had grown long and was now streaked with silver, braided with turquoise beads that caught the morning light. The colorless eyes that had once reflected only ice now held the warm brown of rich earth. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Emma replied, watching a group of mixed children, some bearing the markings of the Star People, others displaying the more subtle signs of awakened human potential, playing a game that seemed to involve levitating colored spheres in complex patterns. "Sometimes it feels like forever." The village had become something unprecedented in human history, a functioning community where awakened and traditional humans lived in complete integration. Scientists worked alongside shamans, engineers collaborated with plant spirits, and children grew up knowing that the impossible was simply another word for not yet understood. Dr. Rebecca Martinez emerged from the research center at the valley's heart, her tablet displaying readings that would have been considered fantasy just 5 years earlier. The quantum physicist had become the village's unofficial translator between scientific methodology and spiritual reality, developing new mathematical frameworks that could describe how consciousness interacted with quantum fields. "The network is stable across all continents," she reported, settling beside Emma on the grass that still held traces of its silver transformation. "The last resistance pockets in Eastern Europe came online yesterday. We're now at full global integration." Emma nodded, feeling the vast web of connection that spanned the planet like a living thing. Sacred sites that had been dormant for millennia now pulsed with renewed energy, their power flowing through ley lines that connected every continent. The awakening that had begun in this small valley had indeed become planetary in scope. "Any word from the Mars colony?" Marcus asked, his question carrying the casual tone of someone who had learned to accept miracles as daily routine. "They've achieved sustainable atmosphere generation using bioluminescent organisms that Dr. Chang's team developed," Dr. Martinez replied. "The plants are thriving in low-gravity conditions, and the colonists report that their enhanced photosynthesis is producing oxygen faster than our most optimistic projections." Emma smiled, remembering the excitement when the first fully integrated humans had volunteered for interplanetary colonization. They had discovered that the awakened consciousness could adapt to environments that would kill traditional humans, their enhanced connection to living systems allowing them to literally commune with alien biospheres. And the ocean cities? Growing faster than planned. The coral symbionts that Tokyo's water shapers developed are regenerating the Great Pacific garbage patch into floating forests. The marine life is more diverse now than it was before industrial pollution began. A familiar figure approached from the village below Joseph Crowfeather, now in his late 40s but moving with the easy grace of someone whose body had learned to work in perfect harmony with the Earth's rhythms. He carried a leather satchel filled with letters and reports from awakened communities around the world. "News from the Australian delegation," he said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside them. "The Aboriginal elders have agreed to open the Dreamtime Navigation Centers to international students. They say the world is finally ready to learn the deep geography." Emma felt a thrill of anticipation. The Dreamtime Centers were legendary among the awakened places, where consciousness could navigate the quantum foam that underlies physical reality, exploring probability streams and alternate timelines with the same ease that traditional humans walked through forests. "What about the resistance movements?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying the weary concern of someone who had once been part of the old system and understood its capacity for self-destruction. Darkened slightly, still active in certain sectors. General Morrison's faction has established fortified zones in parts of Texas and Florida, claiming they're preserving pure human settlements against what they call the contamination. Emma sighed. Not everyone had embraced the awakening with joy. Some humans, usually those who had built their identities around concepts of separation and superiority, had reacted to the integration with fear and hostility. They had formed enclaves, where the old ways of thinking were preserved like precious relics, maintaining artificial boundaries against a world that was learning to flow like water. "They'll come around eventually," Dr. Martinez said with the confidence of someone who had watched countless skeptics transform into believers when confronted with undeniable evidence. "The children born in those enclaves are awakening naturally. You can't fight evolution forever." "Besides," Joseph added with a slight smile, "their settlements are having to deal with climate refugees from the traditional regions that are still struggling with environmental collapse. When you're facing drought and famine, the philosophical purity of separation becomes less important than the practical benefits of cooperation." Emma nodded, but her attention was drawn to something else, a subtle shift in the quantum field that surrounded them, a harmonic that she had been sensing for weeks but couldn't quite identify. It felt like a door opening in a distant room, or a voice calling from just beyond the edge of hearing. "Something's coming," she said quietly. The others fell silent, following her gaze toward the eastern horizon where the morning light seemed to shimmer with more than ordinary brightness. Emma extended her consciousness through the global network, feeling for disturbances or anomalies that might explain the growing sense of anticipation. What she found made her gasp. "They're coming home," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "The star people, the original ones. They're coming home." High above the atmosphere, visible only to those whose sight had been enhanced by awakened consciousness, Ships that looked like crystallized starlight were emerging from the spaces between dimensions. They moved with the fluid grace of living things, their hulls pulsing with the same energy patterns that marked the skin of their descendants. The return had always been prophesied in the oldest stories, that when the Earth children had learned to remember their true nature, when the artificial barriers had dissolved and the world had become whole again, the ancestors who had seeded consciousness among the stars would return to witness what their children had become. Emma stood and raised her mother's staff, now grown, into a full ceremonial pole carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. Around the world, every awakened human felt the call resonate in their bones, not a summons to worship or submission, but an invitation to welcome. Family home after eons of separation. The ships descended slowly, their arrival witnessed by billions of eyes, both human and enhanced. They settled not on the Earth itself, but in the spaces between dimensions that the awakened had learned to navigate, existing in a state that was both there and not there, real and potential simultaneously. When the first being stepped through the dimensional membrane into the sacred valley, Emma felt recognition flood through every cell of her body. Tall, graceful, bearing markings that made her own seem like simple sketches by comparison. The star person looked exactly like the being she had seen in vision since childhood, her great-grandmother's great-grandmother, the first of her line. To walk between worlds. "Welcome home, daughter of stars," the being said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the music of the spheres themselves. "You have done well. All of you have done magnificently well." Emma bowed deeply, not in submission, but in recognition of the love that connected them across impossible distances and incomprehensible time. When she straightened, she saw that the being's eyes held the same infinite depths as her own, the same capacity for bridging realities that had always set her people apart. "We're ready for whatever comes next," she said simply. The star person smiled, and the expression transformed the sacred valley into something that existed beyond the normal parameters of space and time. A place where every possibility was real, every dream was achievable, every hope was justified by the fundamental nature of a universe that had always been more alive, more conscious, and more loving than its children had dared to believe. "Then let us begin," it said. And the real work of integration commenced, not just between human and awakened, not just between earth and sky, but between the physical realm and dimensions of existence that had names only in languages spoken by beings of pure consciousness. Emma Starburn, daughter of two worlds and bridge between all realities, stepped forward into a future that held infinite possibility, carrying with her the love of a silent Lakota brave who had once risked everything to carry a frightened child to safety, and who had thereby saved not just one small girl, but the entire world. The age of separation was over. The age of infinite connection had begun, and the universe itself held its breath in anticipation of what its children would accomplish when they finally remembered that there had never been any limits except the ones they had chosen to accept. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.